Welcome to the 38th episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to give our hot takes on our win over Texas Southern and throw some Hail Mary shots downfield for listeners to love or hate. Let's get started. I never thought we'd hear Traylor say he was disappointed by a win where we scored 52 points, but here it is. UTSA let Texas Southern hang with them through three quarters. The Roadrunners started off sluggish on both offense and defense in the first half and racked up 5 penalties for 70 yards. While Texas Southern never led in the game, they played well and kept the score uncomfortably close at halftime, 21-17. The Roadrunners came alive in the second half, outscoring Texas Southern 31-7, including Eddie Lee Marburger's first TD pass of the year to JT Clark. While it wasn't the dominating first half performance we were all hoping for, there were a number of firsts and records broken in the win. Chris Carpenter returned a kickoff 97 yards for a touchdown, the first in program history. Frank Harris broke the individual single-game passing yardage record at 392 yards and is now the school record holder for career passing touchdowns. JT Clark now holds the record for single-game receiving yards at 217, and he tied his own record of 3 touchdowns in one game. DeJuan Griffin and Avery Morris caught their first career interceptions, and Lucas Dean kicked a 76-yard punt, which broke his own school record. It wasn't the well-executed win Traylor wanted, but a win is a win. The team now closes out non-conference play at 2-2. What were your thoughts on the game?
Well, I kind of felt like the team underestimated Texas Southern. They came out with just some minimal energy and effort. There wasn't that same UTSA Roadrunner team that we're so used to. And, when we're doing the previews and we're kind of looking ahead at, who we're going to be playing, it's easy to look at an FCS opponent and kind of underestimate them, but, you know that they're going to come out and they're going to play hard and they're going to have energy. And the biggest thing that we wanted to see from UTSA was for them to just kind of punch them in the mouth and just kind of demoralize them early. And it just never really happened.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a UT hangover from this week, and we were just kind of tired and not energized in the first half.
Which is weird from a Traylor team, right? Like, they keep talking about the triangle. They keep talking about, this is what their culture is. So this is definitely not something you'd expect from them. And so it's just interesting just to see how they kind of bounce back in this next week against Middle Tennessee State.
Yeah, and hopefully this week, again, knowing Middle Tennessee, knowing that they've been a tough opponent, more so than they probably should have been in the past, will hopefully get them to come out with that same level of energy that we saw when they came out against Houston.
Well, 2020 did have Asher O'Hara, who was essentially being taped, pieced together every single time he came to the sideline. Mm-hmm. One of my fondest memories of the COVID era of UTSA football, because we essentially, it was only 2 or 3 people ahead of us. And obviously there was, it was set up all sorts quite differently. And so we could just see Middle Tennessee and poor Asher O'Hara. I just remember that. But, I digress. Just go back to talking about Texas Southern here. I predicted a score of 55-13, ended up 52-24, like you mentioned. It was close. But, when you're doing a prediction, like I said, there's all sorts of X factors. And you kind of hope that there's, the guys get healthy, that guys are actually able to play, or that they play to their, really to their best of their ability. But you didn't really see that energy. So, did you see any sort of, shoddy play as well?
I mean, yeah, there's definitely poor tackling, which we haven't really seen through the first 3 games. I don't want to say it was necessarily lack of effort. Maybe that was it, but it just seemed like they were very tired throughout the game.
And I totally get that. I just kind of feel like, this is certainly a team that needs a bye week, but that bye week's not coming anytime soon.
No, and that, when we did the preview, was one of the things that concerned me with how far away that bye week was, just given our injury history in the past, but it's certainly worse this year.
Well, and it just seems to fall on the same time. So far the last couple of years, it's right about the end of October. So, you knew that there was going to be a lot of potentially some, healing from those first 3 games. And we thought that this game was just going to be the one where we just put them away and we should be good. But, all for naught. Again, Texas Southern was scrappy, and really, we have to give them credit. And we can't just overlook them and say, well, we were bound to blow them out. Sure. But I didn't expect it to take this much effort.
I sort of feel like this is what it would sound like if we were UT last week talking about the game against UTSA.
Absolutely, because it was, essentially UTSA, in theory, hung with them until the third quarter, but I think it was probably less than that as the injuries started piling up. The thing with Texas Southern, it wasn't like they had a bunch of injuries that were piling up. They did have a couple of injuries on defense, and not trying to minimize, what happened to those young players, but it wasn't like you're seeing Texas Southern player drop and like seeing some of their better players just fall out. No, this was a Texas Southern team that knew that as long as they played hard, they had a chance to at least give a scare. And I kept texting my brother going, oh, UTSA's on upset alert. He's like, nah, they'll pull away in the second half. Yes, they did, but it also was perplexing to see UTSA keep their starters in until, well into the fourth quarter. You made a note of that.
Yeah.
UT.
Yeah. I kept saying when we were playing UT, like, okay, this game has gotten away from the Roadrunners. Why are they still playing their starters? And I sort of felt like Traylor did the same thing. Although, on defense, there's certainly a lot of young kids that were playing. But on offense, we had our starters in. And even when we put Addie Lee in, finally, who I thought looked really great in the game, he was playing with JT Clark, some of the other starters, which, in the past, when you've seen Josh Adkins come in, you typically saw him come in with the twos. You didn't necessarily see him come in with the ones. So even though Eddie Lee was in, he was playing with, the ones still.
Again, interesting. It's certainly felt like the scare was there, whether they choose to acknowledge it or not. I personally thought that Frank could have been taken out in the middle of the third quarter, even with the game pretty close, because it's not like Eddie Lee, to me, was going to make any sort of huge mistakes. Plus, let's put him in a position here to see how he handles some of this adversity, some of these things that are going on. It just didn't seem like he got that opportunity to do so. And I think that's going to be something to kind of look back on at times and say, well, maybe we should have given Eddie Lee a little bit more time here.
And hey, before we did the preview, I said I wanted to see, a Cam Peters sighting in this game. Looked like it wasn't going to happen, but we got our Cam Peters sighting.
He did. And we'll dive into that a little bit here in a little bit. But anything else? Obviously, Traylor said his team was disappointed by the performance, not as clean as they wanted to be, but I don't know how much else we can harp on that. Overall, just not the performance we would have liked, like you said.
But a win is a win.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go into the special teams review. Look, there was poor kick return coverage here by UTSA, and it was evidenced by the fact that we started pooching the kicks late in the game because we didn't want to give up a bunch of yards. What's ridiculous about it is that it's an FCS team. It's not like they had somebody that was really explosive. It's just that our guys just were lackadaisical. And again, go back to what you said. There are some guys that are probably out there playing that, this is maybe one of their first times on kick return coverage, but I think this goes back to coaching. This is, you knew that you were going to bring in some of these guys. It just seems like we weren't as prepared for this.
Yeah, and we've played very well in terms of our kick return coverage, through the first three games. That was certainly an area where we struggled last season, but it really had seemed to be cleaned up. Although, part of it was Sackett's much more consistent about kicking the ball through the end zone on those kickoff returns as compared to, Hunter last year.
Yeah, and I think that's what's perplexing is that, you probably knew exactly what was going on or you should know your assignment, I guess I should say. And it didn't seem like those assignments were being fulfilled. It just seems like at times that special teams being like an afterthought, and we see some of the problems really throughout the first four games. So, again, wondering if there's going to be some things cleaned up here because, if you have to pooch some kicks, that's just pretty much waving the flag and saying, we don't trust the guys that are on the field to essentially make a play and stop you guys from returning it.
But you can't talk about special teams without talking about the record-setting first kickoff return, though.
Right. But one thing is kickoff coverage. This one was, kickoff return. And the kickoff return, really, I think it was set up beautifully. I think one of the things that I was impressed about with Chris Carpenter was that he was patient. He let his blocks set up as opposed to, you get eager sometimes. And we hadn't really seen Chris back there fielding any kicks. So when we looked back there and saw that it was him, we're like, oh, okay, this is something new, because we were expecting like a JT Clark or, even a Josh Cephas who's been fielding punts. Instead, you see Chris, and again, I will restate, he really was patient. And, that's what really was, I think, the biggest thing about the kickoff return was, obviously he's incredibly fast, he's talented, but to let the game kind of slow down a little bit and give you a little bit of time so your guys can go and do their job. Texas Southern really didn't do a very good job of, getting their gunners down there to cover Chris. But, I think that was really the signal for Chris to take advantage of all that.
Right.
One other thing that we wanted to mention was Jared Sackett on the first PAT kind of clanked it off the one of the uprights.
I couldn't really tell when we were at the game that happened. I remember you saying something looked a little off, but it really wasn't until we rewatched the game that you could see, like, we got lucky that it just bounced back inside.
And I think that had it missed, and I'm not saying, but had it missed, it would have felt like the perfect bad start for UTSA, right? Like there had already been some signs that it could be a bad start. Second play of the game, essentially after the Texas Southern, returns their kick, they gave up a long rush on the ground, right? So it kind of felt like, things just aren't moving like they should. And it was sort of the first signal, right? So, let's go on to the offensive review. So let's start out with a preview review. The only thing I had said was to execute the offense as they have all season. And really, it was just to give Texas Southern no hope, like just kind of demoralize their defense. I mean, they do have some, like I said, they had some athletes, they have some guys that can play. I felt like the offense kind of sputtered. It didn't seem very
clean, crisp.
Well, sure, it just didn't seem. I think the play calling left me a little perplexed because it was clear they wanted to really kind of focus on that rush game, but we couldn't bully anybody on the defensive line, and I thought that was just incredibly perplexing to me. And I think some of the schemes, and I think some of the just trying to be stubborn and trying to really continue to rush the ball when I think there's other strengths on the team. But let's talk about that struggle on the ground. Again, we expected more success against an FCS team, but it was 27 rushing attempts for 112 yards. Now it's 4 yards a rush, so that lines up about like what we used to do last year, but essentially you'd have Sincere that would do that alone. Mm-hmm. This took I think it was 3-4 backs that were doing that. That and add a Kavorian Barnes fumble that was just, it was just bad ball security from a young back. And, something that I had pointed out in the beginning of the year was Sincere just didn't fumble. He just had great ball security. And then here we go against an FCS team, there was some bad blocking, and then Kavorian just coughs it up. It just re-emphasized the fact that our team just really wasn't here to play, wasn't mentally focused on this game. And I don't know, what did you think about the run game?
Two thoughts. One is, of course we know that we have these injuries on the offensive line, but again, you would expect that even with the struggles that we've faced against an FCS opponent, we'd still have more success. However, I also feel like at times Traylor just keeps just pushing and pushing to try to develop that run game, and it almost becomes overly stubborn at some point. It's look, I'm not trying to advocate that we're an air raid team, but we know that we have strength in Frank's passing game. We know that we have 3 of the best wide receivers in the G5 ranks. Just lean into it. Again, you're going to have to run the ball occasionally because you want to have that threat that Frank or the running back can scramble, and so you're constantly keeping the defense on edge about which direction you're going to go. But maybe this just isn't going to be that run first year for us.
It's certainly perplexing. I think that obviously we've had some problems with the rushing game, but I think what's more interesting is the fact that a season back like Brendan Brady can't get popped loose. Obviously some of that's offensive line, but I think that's also some Brendan Brady. I think there's a lack of explosiveness right now in the running back room without Treylon Smith. Obviously you weren't going to try to rush Treylon Smith back for this game. This was a game you thought like Brendan Brady could just kind of grind out a whole bunch of rushes and potentially, again, get that push, but he didn't.
Kind of like that UTEP game, that he had when Sincere was gone 2 years ago.
Right. But, it just didn't happen. And, I think there's just a lack of explosiveness in the run game. There's a lack of just pop. And maybe it's just a Sincere hangover. I hate to keep bringing up Sincere, but it feels like, there is, I think, maybe more of a loss. I think after 4 games, you kind of feel like there's more of a loss in the running back room. Now, there have been injuries, but, something's got to give here. Are we going to get somebody stepping up? We not? I don't know. But let's talk about quarterback play because I think that was a little bit more encouraging. We talked a little bit about Eddie Lee. He really looked good moving the offense. I want to say that the passes were pretty crisp. It looked... he's clearly a much more natural passer than Frank. But, you can certainly tell that he's gotten enough reps with some of these wide receivers to have a good rapport. Just the way he's delivering the ball was really clutch. And I think that's what really made me want him to be in there sooner, just to give Frank a rest. We saw Frank get banged up at the end of the first half. And so that got kind of concerning because it's like, well, maybe he just plays the halftime, whatever the score is, and we just go with Eddie Lee. And we just didn't. It's like that didn't happen. So any thoughts on just how you felt about it, at least for those 2 quarterbacks?
Yeah, no, I thought Eddie Lee looked really good, considering that, we know that he had some kind of injury over the summer. And there was kind of this question mark about him and the difference between him and Cam Peters. Seeing him come out and play at UT and then seeing him come out and play in this game, he seems like he's definitely developing and he's moving the right direction. And, if you needed to give Frank more rest in some games, you could. Obviously we want Frank to be as healthy as possible for those key conference games. And every time he hurdles a defender or gets smacked around, you just kind of hold your breath because there's still, Eddie Lee still needs to continue to develop. He's not Frank, but, at least you feel better seeing him and seeing his development that, he could take over in the 4th quarter and you wouldn't have to be up by 25 points to feel confident putting, Eddie Lee in the game.
I think over the last 2 games, he's looked really good. Obviously I'm not trying to say that he's, a perfect quarterback, but just certainly encouraged to see that performance. Now, I wasn't as encouraged with Cam Peters. I know it was late in the game, and, obviously you're just trying to call a couple plays. You're not really trying to, really run anything big, but it seemed, even in just those 3 plays that he had, that the game is still moving really fast for him. Whereas with Eddie, it just seems like the game is slowing down. He was natural in the way he was throwing the ball. Cam didn't throw the ball, but it still seemed like a young quarterback who still needs more time. And if he were to see the field, it'd be a little bit... You're definitely going to be on edge, regardless of the score, because he just needs that time and more time to develop. And I think as we continue seeing how this quarterback room grows over the next couple of years, it's going to be interesting to see just where Cam ends up. But
hopefully we'll see him again in the FIU game, but we'll get to that later.
Sure. All right. Only other thing I wanted to talk about was just really the offensive player of the game. And to me, that was JT Clark. 9 catches, 217 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was definitely more physical and a much tougher cover than I think, Texas Southern would like to admit. Though, I had said in my preview, you have their top cornerback, who's Isaiah Hamilton, who did I thought, a good job on these receivers whenever they were on them. But my guy is I think he's a sophomore and he's still pretty light. And, as well as he did battling there against our top 3 receivers, There was just that first touchdown pass that Frank threw, to begin the second half, that poor Isaiah was looking for the ball, and he was looking the other way. Just didn't see it. Yeah, I'm not trying to make fun of him. It's just, again, you felt the overmatch. Right, that moment, I felt like, that would be me. I was covering one of these guys. It's, obviously, these guys are just something else. And, good for JT. I think he had, obviously one of the top games in UTSA history. Let's go to the defense. Talked about the preview review that the defensive line, I felt, needed to bully that offensive line. And while they had their moments, they really seemed to struggle against this offensive line that was not really an imposing one. Mm-hmm. It just seemed like Texas Southern used a little bit of our athleticism against us, and they used misdirection on us. And this is not the first time that we've seen misdirection really hamper this team. This defense, though, just has problems with assignments. They weren't covering where they're supposed to be covering. And I think at times, especially because, in my opinion, the game was so close and we couldn't find that comfortable separation until essentially late in the second half, it felt like everybody started trying to make plays when plays they just needed to, complete their assignment and, we'd be okay. But, I hesitate to say hero ball, but it felt like at times there was a lot of hero ball going out there saying, oh, I can beat this offensive lineman. I'm going to try to do something that is not within the play. Mm-hmm. That said, and even then, Lep kind of had some curious defensive alignments. Obviously, I saw some others say the same thing, specifically like Jared from Alamo Audible had said something like that too. So, it's cool when you see that others are seeing some of this stuff, because it seemed bizarre that we were lining up in certain formations on defense, and it just seemed like, are we that cocky that we're going to be able to do that, and we think that Texas Southern's going to just kind of fold this way? It was just, to me, a bizarre game plan from the defense.
Yeah, Traylor had mentioned in one of his interviews that he felt it was tough on the defense because on the offensive side, because they weren't running the ball, they were going heavy on passing, and they were scoring fast, and so defense was getting tired, and there were...
Oh, Coach Traylor, come on. I just want to give him come on, man, stop it. Like, that's something you control, and that's something that you're going to play fast, so you've got to have your players ready. Like, that's something that he's talked about. Like, I want to play fast. I want to do all these things. That's something you can control, and that can happen during any game, so I just think that that's a flimsy excuse to throw out there. So with that, let's talk about the defensive player of the game. Danye Taylor is my guy. He's replacing his brother, and we kind of need something there because
spark.
Obviously this team really needed somebody to get things going, and I'm not going to call out any specific Danye Taylor play. I just thought he was consistent throughout the game, and at the very least was much better at playing his assignments. But there's not much you can do when you play your assignment and then you see somebody else not doing what they're supposed to. Makes it so much more difficult to make plays. But Danye, great job on the game.
What did we learn from the game?
Well, let me ask you this. Is this team too emotional this year?
Definitely. If you look back at the team last year, they were so focused and dialed in on all of the games. This year, we've had, like Kalechi said in the postgame, an emotional roller coaster. We had the emotion from the Houston game, the hangover after that, the emotions going into the UT game, clearly a hangover after that. And it just definitely seems like they are letting the highs get too high and the lows get too low compared to what we saw last year. And that's not the intent of the culture that Traylor's established. And so it's a little surprising and a little disconcerting.
So would you potentially chalk that up to some of that being youthful immaturity since we're young at some positions? Or do you just think it's permeated even from the senior leadership?
I think it starts at the top. We've seen a more emotional Traylor this year than we've seen in the past. And yes, there are young guys that I'm sure are very emotional. I mean, again, Traylor said it a million times. these are, young men and they're emotional. But he's seemed more emotional and more of a high and low in his press conference. And he sets the tone for the team.
That's a good point. I mean, do you think that because hasn't been able to really be stabilized and just kind of be sort of, have his emotions in check like we've kind of talked about over the last 3 weeks, do you think that is really affecting the team and even his coaches more?
I would say so. I mean, I think it affects the team regardless of what he says. It probably affects the coaches or it's his reaction to maybe having a younger coaching staff. And when I say younger coaching staff, I just mean, he's got a lot of people in different positions this year than he had last year. And maybe that's part of his frustration of things not going as well with some of those coaching changes, or just kind of going through those growing pains of being new at your role than maybe what he anticipated.
It's kind of funny because, in talking about this, he almost sounds like a guy that's one big loss away from getting fired, but that's certainly not the case.
No.
And I think that's the emotional part of it that you've been talking about. So let me ask you this, because you've been big on this, and this is something you've talked about various times over the last couple of years that we've been podcasting. It's year 3 of trailer.
Yeah, if you go back and you look at year 3 of FBS, and with Coker you have to look at the third year of FBS. That was the year when the wheels kind of started to fall off for Coker. Year 3, Wilson, the wheels started to fall off for Wilson. So I had said, many times, kind of looking forward at that trailer tenure, what's year 3 going to look like? And the way that he's talking and the way that he's so emotional, it's almost like, like there's some risk or some letdown. Look, I know there's pressure on you because we won Conference USA last year. We had a phenomenal season. But realistically, it was going to be very, very challenging to follow that up with the same type of record, just given the difference in our conference play. And I don't think that, I'm sure there are fans out there who want to be very frustrated because we've lost 2 games. But really, if you look at what UTSA was expected to do, we're right where we should be. 2-2 is kind of where people thought we were going to be. So I get you still have these expectations, but I think a lot of those expectations Trailer's putting on himself. He's anticipating that the fans and the media and everyone's going to turn on him if we don't have this 12-2 season again. But there might be fans that will do that. I mean, San Antonio's notoriously fickle. But you can't let that get to you because it's not realistic. You just have to do what he says he wants to do. Focus on the brand, make sure that they're executing well, make sure that they're, playing clean, next man up mentality. He needs to just, in my opinion, kind of go back to those fundamentals and set the emotion aside, because you hearing this emotion throughout all of these interviews, that that's what they're hearing in the locker room. And I just don't think that that's good. We're going to go into Middle Tennessee and talk about that in a couple minutes. They're coming off of this big win. We got to be dialed in. We got to be focused. And we got to control what we can control. It's one of the things that they talk about in our culture. We just need to focus on our culture.
I think you summed that up really well. And I thought I was going to just give you some time there. Not to I wouldn't call it a rant. I think
I'm going to get off my soapbox now.
No, I'm just saying, I think you had this all in your head, and I wanted to make sure just give you that kind of freedom to just get it out, because I think you speak for a lot of fans. I think you speak for a lot of other people watching and saying, oh, this does seem weird. It feels like we're about to, he thinks we're about to fire him, and it's like, no, yeah. We knew that there'd be adversity. Now, the adversity has been probably a little bit more than even he anticipated, and so I think he's also having some struggles, I think coming to terms with the fact that, he may have lost a couple guys,
he
needs for the
to get
season.
Out of his head and just focus on, the fundamentals that he set up. Trust his culture.
I think that's well put. Now, not something we maybe learned in this game, but I think learned post-game was we were kind of putting together our notes for this, for Middle Tennessee, and we were anticipating some, really some guys to return from injury. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. We thought that potentially Traylon Smith, Mekhi Hart, and Joe Evans might be back. I think Joe Evans is definitely a long shot. The way he looked in terms of his therapy certainly has more of an ankle issue that's probably going to keep him out a little bit longer. But we've got D-line depth, so that's not as big. The Mekhi Hart one is the one that I think really hurts because I think that's going to really impact here in the Middle Tennessee game when we go through the preview here in a few minutes. But certainly I think that, with the tackles, as he talked about today in the interviews, not being able to come back, and then, who knows about Traylon or even Day-Day.
Yeah, it seemed like at least he mentioned that Day-Day had practiced, and he did make a comment that if someone hadn't practiced, he wasn't going to take him to Middle Tennessee. So at least there's a shot that Day-Day will come back, depending on, how he continues to, recover. But no mention about Traylon, although I thought that Traylor had mentioned prior to the Texas Southern game that he was keeping Traylon out as precaution. So maybe we'll see him, but there really hasn't been any discussion about him.
And we were hoping, I think, just from this game, going to be able to say, hey, we learned that potentially post-game that we got some guys coming back, so that's good going into conference. Short week, this is going to be tough. So let's get started talking about Middle Tennessee. So let's talk Middle Tennessee. Let's get into the preview.
Yeah, I know you were happy that this is the last time you're going to be previewing Middle Tennessee for hopefully a couple of years.
These guys have been a team that we played. This is the
thorn in our side.
It's the third year in a row. Obviously in COVID year, it was just a game that kind of came up, and they used as a replacement game. We kind of referenced earlier in this pod about Asher O'Hara and how he was taped up essentially. And somehow almost willed Middle Tennessee to a win there. And then last season...
We broke their quarterback last season.
Yeah.
And built up this new guy.
Well, we have one guy essentially retire at halftime, and then, Chase Cunningham comes in, who honestly didn't get on a roll until later in the second half, once our second string, third string defense came in. But let's talk about the fact that they just upset Miami 45-31 in Miami. Okay, so I was wondering, looking at the attendance, I was like, it's so sporadic. There's a whole bunch of fans all over the place in the Miami Stadium. Well, it's because they were in a weather delay for the longest time. So with bad weather in the area, hey, that's what happens when you got an outdoor stadium. Dome, sweet dome is all I'm going to say. Look, that I think caused some fans to stay away. But Miami, definitely not back. They were not good, especially Miami quarterback Ty Van Dyke. He threw an interception on his first pass of the game. A couple of plays later, when they finally got the ball back, he throws a pick six. And then they had another fumble. They essentially turned the ball over 3 times in the first 3 shots.
Yeah, I'm just gonna read the first half plays for Miami here. Interception, touchdown, fumble, field goal, turnover on downs, fumble, touchdown, into half. That was how Miami played the first half of the game.
And the first interception was a bad interception. He really stared down his receiver, and because of it, had the cornerback jump the route and get the interception. The second one was kind of weird because he was trying to throw essentially out to the flat, and defensive end Zaylen Woods made a terrific play by just putting his paw up, tipped it in the air to himself, and then took it for a touchdown. Poor lineman, the tackle was looking around trying to figure out where the ball went. He turned around on Zaylen because Zaylen made a great play, just popped it up to himself. So really, I'm going to give credit to Middle Tennessee. They could have gotten up big on Miami and just let them come back. But one thing that they did was they were there, they were feisty, and they gave Miami everything that they could handle. Miami's just not good. it really comes down to the fact that they just don't have very good quarterback play. But that's a lot of these P5 teams. And the reason I think the P5 teams are getting upset this season, or more of them, are because they don't have a good quarterback, a good solid quarterback. And you notice like a team like, UTSA with Frank Harris. We talk about all the great things Frank has been able to do. And, having some consistent quarterback play really goes a long way when you're playing P5 teams. Now we're in conference. So let's talk about Chase Cunningham. Average at best. Like, I wouldn't say that he's a runner. He just will kind of escape a little bit. At least Bailey Zappi last year, when we talked about Western Kentucky, seemed to kind of like take off, and get yards here or there once receivers were down the field. Chase Cunningham really isn't doing that. Like, he's more of a, I'm going to stay in the pocket and try to find someone. But they've really kind of retooled this offense to be more air raid. But instead of really passing it around, they've been using it more to set up the run. He's an okay passer. I think the new system, though, has him kind of got him hesitant. His interception was really like one that he threw behind the receiver, and he just flinched. It looked like he was ready to release the ball, and he hesitated, and then he let it rip. And by that point, he threw it behind his receiver, and it was just an easy interception for Miami. He still looked like that, even though he threw a few nice balls that were long passes that broke, that Miami secondary apart. But it wasn't like he just picked them apart. It was more the fact that Miami just played poor defense. And so it just made it so much easier for Chase to make those throws. Running back Frank Peasant is their top running back. Again, pretty average. He's really a bullish runner. And I think what concerns me about him, though, is even though I said he's average, he reminds me of somewhat of like Brendan Brady, but also the Texas Southern running backs who were just kind of going into the line and then just kind of bullying, our defensive line and linebackers and really pushing that scrum a few yards down the field. So, something to look out for because they do rush the ball a little bit more than they pass it. Now, these wide receivers, they're pretty short. You got DJ England Chisholm, who had a big 98-yard touchdown catch against Miami. Jalen Lane, Elijah Metcalf, Yusuf Ali, they're all below 5'10", but they were pretty quick. So it makes this air raid pretty difficult to kind of, at times, I would say, defend because of the fact that they're just small men. That's what they are. They're small, and we have more size at cornerback, so I just kind of, hopefully we can, even though that we've got some good coverage guys, I just hope that we can stay up with these guys because of the fact that these guys can make a couple moves here or there, and it could cause some problems for our defense. Their tallest wide receiver is Isaiah Gaithings. I think I'm saying his last name right. He's 6'4". He's pretty solid. He leads the team in receptions though with 24. Probably because he's 6'4" and he's easier for Chase Cunningham to see. Chase Cunningham himself is 5'11", so it's not a very tall team that we've got going against. So hopefully there's some things that we can do here on defense. That OL is big but pretty unspectacular. They're just rated pretty low in terms of PFF, and from what I saw against Miami, they didn't look very impressive. They just gave Chase enough time to tear apart the secondary, which was 1 or 2 seconds. So let's go to the defense. This is the strength to me of Middle Tennessee, and this is what makes them quite dangerous. Certainly Traylor's talked about the fact that their defense coordinator has been there for a while, but they've got some players. Jordan Ferguson, essentially he plays all over the defensive line, but he's essentially like a defensive end. He's a monster. He's probably going to be used to pick on Frankie Martinez. Honestly, if Mekhi Hart's not back yet, this would be a tough assignment even for Mekhi Hart to come back to against Jordan Ferguson. This guy can play. I think of a poor man's, I can't remember the guy's name for Army, but their All-American linebacker. I would say he's a poor man's version of him. Still a monster, I think, for Conference USA. Marley Cook is their defensive tackle. He leads the team with 4 sacks. And Quindarius Dunnigan is another beast on that defensive line. They just seem to live in the backfield at times. This is a very good defensive team, starting with their defensive line. Kind of reminds you of, the runners. Now, the linebackers are Jalen Davis and Christian Dixon. They played well, and they lead that linebacker crew. They haven't played as many snaps, but it's clear that they use these guys, and when they play, they're the best options they have. So These are guys who are going to be making some plays here, and I imagine are going to be the main cogs in trying to slow down Frank and Brendan or whoever's at running back. Their secondary to me is pretty average, though they do have a pretty good cornerback in DeCorian Patterson. They got two safeties, Teldrick Ross and Trey Flulellen. They're among the top three tacklers within the team. So when your safeties are some of your top tacklers on the team, it pretty much means that you're getting quite a bit of runners or receivers going into your secondary, and that's not very good. But don't underestimate this Middle Tennessee defense. It's pretty stout. It's just, can their offense actually set their defense up for success? So UTSA keys to victory. Looking out from today being Monday for Friday. For me, it's try to manufacture a run game. See if you can catch them off guard, maybe some draw plays. I think that would be good to at least keep this defensive line off balance. And potentially slow down that pass rush, because I think that's really what's going to be a key here, because we're going to have to, key number 2 is protect Frank at all costs here. Like, this defensive line is good, and so is their linebacking crew, and they could potentially get into Frank's face, and you definitely aren't going to want him getting pressure up the middle. I don't believe that they'll be able to get pressure up the middle, but definitely on the sides they will, and so that certainly going to be something to look out for. On defense, we're going to have our defensive linemen and outside linebackers make Chase Cunningham uncomfortable. I said he's not much of a scrambler, so I think we need to get some pass rush on him, but we've kind of struggled in that area this year, so hopefully we can get something going there. And then that defensive line just needs to kind of clog up some of those holes. Based on the kind of defense we run, which is like a 3-3-5, which may change because of the fact that this is sort of an air raid offense. Certainly we need them to be able to plug some of those holes, because we probably are going to drop some of these linebackers into coverage as well. I think the second key here is secondary coverage, but I'm not as worried about it because our cornerbacks are so solid. Mayfield, Fortune, even DeJuan Griffin, very good. And I think having those three out there against their receivers should be fine. It's just, again, I hesitate because of their size, because we've just got larger cornerbacks. Mm-hmm. But I think we can certainly lull them into getting a couple of interceptions here. So I'm looking forward to seeing if we can get some turnovers here on this Middle Tennessee defense, or offense, sorry. So way too early prediction. Does UTSA come out with some energy and urgency? It's conference play, so there's no more excuses. This is it. This is what we've been, kind of gearing towards, and these are the games that really count. I get that we are 2-2 out of conference, but this is what determines conference championships. So this is going to be huge. UTSA can't come out playing like they did against Texas Southern and believe that they can just turn it on to win. That's does Middle Tennessee have a Miami hangover? They've been really inconsistent over the last few years, and I don't think anything's changed. They beat up on essentially Miami, which is huge, obviously a great win, but they also beat up on Colorado State, and Colorado State is probably the second worst P5 team in the nation. Worst being their in-state rival, Colorado. Colorado's even worse. Colorado's not having a great year in terms of college football, but I just, I hesitate to give Colorado State or Middle Tennessee too much props for beating up on Colorado State, considering that last week Sacramento State beat up on Colorado State. Sacramento State is quarterbacked by Asher O'Hara. Whew. It all comes full circle, right? All right, so I think UTSA is going to struggle just a little bit in pass coverage, because I just think that because of their quickness on with their wide receivers, it's just in a short week. I think it's tough to duplicate at first in practice. We'll see though. I mean, we'll obviously get a good read in the first half, but I think UTSA kind of stays with them. I think Middle Tennessee keeps this close, but give me UTSA 31-27 with UTSA recovering a late Middle Tennessee onside kick to seal the win.
All right. Before we go, let's talk a little bit Conference USA Roundup.
Let's do it.
UTEP beat Boise State 27-10. Huge win for UTEP.
You think so?
It's UTEP.
Boise State isn't the darling that they've been in years past. They've really gone downhill. So
didn't they fire their offensive coordinator after that game? And their quarterback hit the transfer portal.
Kind of sounds like UTSA last year with Middle Tennessee, right? Like they just
UTEP
really
broke
ripped
them.
Yeah, they did.
Look, they won this game. UTEP won this game on the ground. You've criticized Hardison, but this time they game planned so that they didn't really ask too much of Hardison.
Well, and that's what you need to win, right? Like the UTEP defense was stout. They were tough, and I questioned what Boise State was trying to run on UTEP because they kept trying to go east-west on them instead of trying to go north-south. Like, anyway, I digress there, but yeah, as much as they talk about Gavin Hardison, they kept the ball out of his hands. Like he only threw 11 times,
but he made 10 out of those 11 throws.
Well, I'd hope so because they rushed it 47 times, but that even those rushing gains weren't very big. It was just kind of moving the pile. It was not an impressive run game, really. It was just, we're just going to play tough defense, and that's what really sparked some of those things. Plus, they got a punt return for a touchdown, so spare me. This offense wasn't as great to show. But, of course, UTEP overreacted, and it's like, you didn't beat anybody big. They're down. Boise State is down, so I still give them credit. They won. They could have, again, much like Middle Tennessee, folded against a Miami. Like Middle Tennessee could have folded against Miami. UTEP could have folded against Boise State because even though they won the game, they still was a very tenuous game throughout. So,
Western Kentucky, on the other hand, killed FIU, 73-0. 688 yards of total offense for Western Kentucky.
And I saw that a lot of them were starting to flex their muscles, oh, Western Kentucky, we didn't go anywhere. We're still here. We're still as good as, when Bailey Zappi was there. Yeah, really easy to start talking trash when you beat up on a kid that essentially is 5 years younger than you and 100 pounds lighter than you. Okay, FIU is the worst G5 team. They know that's it's a rebuild, but come on. You're going to start flexing your muscles after that win? You get the 124th ranked schedule in the nation. Everybody made fun of UTSA's strength of schedule last year. We're going to make fun of Western Kentucky's.
And what was nearly the upset of Conference USA, Rice almost beat Houston at home. Almost.
I had to tell you, Atos, I think Rice might be for real. I think they found their quarterback in McMahon, and they've got Luke McCaffrey, who, was a scatter-armed quarterback, but they made him into a wide receiver, much like his dad.
Apparently, he's a good wide receiver.
Well, his dad was a terrific wide receiver. Ed McCaffrey was terrific for the Denver Broncos. So something rubbed off on Luke here, and I think he might make essentially a name for himself as a wide receiver. It's that traditional Rice big play wide receiver that no matter what, somehow the guy always makes plays. It's like they don't have any other receiving threats, but somehow Luke will still make plays, right? They do have a couple of other players, but I gotta tell you, I'm impressed with what Bloomgren has been able to turn around this year, especially considering the last couple of years. It seems like he was on his way to getting fired, and I even kind of predicted I think maybe he might not be coaching the UTSA game by the time we get there. But good for them. I'm happy to see Rice kind of come back and not just be that kind of easy win that everybody can mark up on, and I'm kind of curious to see.
Like FIU, apparently.
Sure, but I kind of look forward to seeing them upset somebody because that's what they've done.
Not UTSA.
I'm glad we said that in unison because I don't think that'll happen, but I think they could give, based on what I've seen from Rice, they could give UTSA a hard time.
Well, let's just hope that they give UTEP and North Texas a hard time. How about that?
They will.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us. So thank you for joining us on the Hail Mary podcast. I'm Atos.
And I'm the Toes.
We'll be back next week to recap our win against Middle Tennessee.
Don't make it seem like a question. Birds up.